Yeah, hey guys. You were cutting out for me quite a lot. I just want to make sure that that's not a problem on my end. So can anyone just let me know if they can hear me clearly?
Yeah, yeah, clear.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Well, nice to meet you guys. Happy to be here. I'm going to talk about case prep strategies. I picked that topic from the ones that were on offer because it seemed like the broadest one. So it allows us to go through as many questions as you guys have. I'm going to keep my side fairly short. So I'm going to give a high-level overview of how I think of case prep strategies and how I think about prep for case prep, if that makes sense. And then once I've talked about a few things which I feel like are sometimes not super obvious when you're prepping, I'm happy to just spend the majority of this going through any questions you have. Case prep is one of those things where everyone will have some kind of question. So I think it's best if we make this as interactive as possible. I'm going to share my screen in a second where I will be using, because of the nature of the session on case prep, a Word document where I will be going through some things in real time. And once we're done with that, I'm happy to just keep it super open-ended. Before I start, I'll just say, if you have any questions, just honestly make yourself audible and just ask me because I will be on the Word document. So it'll make it just slightly difficult for me to track questions in the chat, or someone can flag them for me from the debate forum. Right, let's get into it. Okay, I need your help one more time. Can someone let me know if they can see a Word document which says case prep methods?
Yes, we can.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. All right. I'm going to slightly enlarge the font here just to make sure it's as legible as possible. And then I'll clean up the formatting for this and send this over in case it's valuable for people. Yeah, so I'm going to cover, I think, 4 things which I think are not obvious when it comes to case prep. I'm not going to cover things which I'm assuming are covered in anyone who's ever talked about case prep, like, how to make an argument, working with your teammate, things like that. I'm assuming that's like stuff that you guys are broadly aware of. Happy to get into that in general questions and answers, if that would be helpful. But I really want to focus on a few things which I think are sort of non-obvious in case prep. So the first thing that I think my debate partner and I used to think about quite a lot is how do we use facts in debate and framing arguments? And this is something that I spoke about a few years ago, and I felt like it would be good to sort of bring this back because I think it can be valuable for how you contextualize your claims. So a few things here. So the first is I often feel like when people are making claims, they start with the claim and think of a fact. And I think my partner and I found it quite effective to start with facts and about intervening sometime. What happens is people start thinking, well, I have to come up with an argument for why intervention in this case is bad, or I have to come up with an argument for why this particular form of the welfare state doesn't work, whatever it might be. And what that often does is starting with claims often makes you vulnerable to making claims which are too general. So if you think of like most debates, you will notice that like most social welfare debates will have like a similar set of arguments on, protecting the market economy versus protecting vulnerable folks. What is the best way to protect vulnerable folks? Are governments effective arbiters of resources and hence of providing aid and assistance to vulnerable communities? All of those things just come up in every sort of social welfare debate. So the problem there is I've often judged debates on the other side of debates where within 2 minutes of the debate, you just look at each other and you say, wow, I've seen this argument be made 50 times. Here's the response. I mean, one, you're just like vulnerable to people using generic responses against generic arguments. But the second is against like decent teams, like you will almost never win. The third, I guess, is for the judge's perspective. They've already judged your argument before you finish making it, because again, it's starting from a fairly generic premise. So I would really underline this then. I think it's really important when you get into case prep to be like, what are facts about the world that I can think of where this argument is relevant? So in a debate about social welfare, let's say in the EU or something, my debate partner and I would be like, what's happened recently that has made this debate come up? And even if you can't think of something that's happened recently to the extent that the CAs are like, we should make this a motion, you're like, what are just general facts about this that have happened? So starting with facts means that you will extract arguments which are more specific to each debate, not just the debate theme. So if there's a debate about social welfare in Pakistan, in this case, let's say, starting with claims about why social welfare is good or bad is just going to mean that you will lose most debates. But if you start with, do I know any facts about social welfare in Pakistan? And then index on that fact, rely on that fact to think of arguments. You just end up making claims which are much more specific, much more grounded, much harder to rebut, much more interesting for the judge to listen to. Now, I feel like almost no teams do this. They're often starting with an argument, which is, again, like, you know, if you think about it academically and scientifically, the genuine way to do something, which is to start with a hypothesis and then get to the facts in a second. Whereas I feel like in debate, because of the way it's structured, it's good to start with a set of facts and then figure out where the argument will go from there. I think that's the first big lesson. The second lesson on facts is it's vital to think of facts in debate that are trends and patterns over facts in isolation. So this is another thing where I feel like a lot of debaters suffer during case prep and in terms of framing their arguments, building on them, which is often I've judged debates, been in debates where someone would make their claim rely on, if you think about it, just like a couple of key facts. So for instance, I don't know, the country X should not invade country Y because when country X invaded country Z, it went really badly. And you're like, yes. So then I guess I just have to show that that first example where country X invaded country Z is just not representative, right? So like, you know, you can take the US invasion in Iraq, and then you can throw up 3 other interventions against that. You can take the social welfare debate, and someone's relying on this one fact about how it went quite poorly in country X. And you're like, well, that's one country in one place. It's unclear to us why that's sort of representative of the claim at large. And I think making claims informed by facts which are broader in scope, both by time and space, makes them much more robust to criticism. So for instance, like if there's like a debate about the IMF, and instead of saying, look at what happened in Greece or something, where someone can just be like, well, here's the specific things that were different about Greece, so this claim doesn't make sense. You're like, well, over a 50-year period, 3 countries have been able to pay back their debt to the IMF out of 110. That fact is quite hard to frame out of the debate. That fact is quite hard to dilute in terms of its essence and value to the claim that's being made. So I think another thing I would just do in case prep again is really think about a series of facts in debate which apply broadly across space and time. That tends to be quite helpful, more interesting for the judge, more compelling to the person watching, and just harder to rebut from the other speaker. Those were like the 2 sort of, I think, takeaways about facts where I felt like people were perhaps approaching how they integrate facts into case prep in a slightly sort of suboptimal manner. Now I'm going to make 2 observations about claims, where I feel like, again, these are some things which aren't obvious in case prep strategies. Before I shift from facts in case prep to making claims in case prep, are there any questions about what I just said? If you have general questions, I'm happy to talk about them in like 10 minutes, basically. But if you have questions on this so far, I'm just going to wait for a second to see if anyone does. Roland, I think, yeah. Yeah, but Roland, I think you should, just make yourself audible.
I have a question. So using these facts, I feel like, are they it feels like it's only limited to like stuff like policy debates and real world debates. In debates like prefer motions where you prefer a world that maybe doesn't exist, how can you still use facts? Because like this like specific world doesn't exist, so there is probably no facts about that world. I don't become my question.
So no, I get your question. So I think the first way in how you frame the question is very different from the last way you frame the question. So in terms of the first way, which is, does this only apply to policy debates? What about this house prefers debate? Like I can think of like dozens of debates, like this house prefers a world without organized religion. This house prefers a world without a capitalist economy. There's like lots of radical reimaginations you can think of the world where you can evidence lots of facts. I think the thing that you said towards the end was slightly different, where I think there you get into problems with counterfactuals. So yes, you're right. In some debates, and they don't have to be this house prefers debates, they can be this house believes that debates. There are going to be certain key debates where you're literally trying to prove something that has never happened anywhere across space and time. I will say those are incredibly rare. They're a lot more rare than I think the first half of your question implied, because I think there's many this house prefers a debate and this house believes that debate where you can marshal evidence on trends and patterns. I think they're the best thing to do, to your point, is to find analogs. So for instance, if there's a debate like this house prefers a world where humanity was aware of the existence of aliens, right? Like now that's hard. That's unlike this house prefers a world without organized religion or a capitalist system or something. Like it is hard to think of like an obvious analog to it. What we used to do is try to think of analog trends and patterns. So for instance, this house prefers a world where we're aware of, an alien existence. Well, immediately I start thinking, what is the most similar thing that's happened to the existence of aliens? And the first thing, I think we've actually been in this debate. And I think the first thing that we thought of was, well, discovering the existence of each other. In other words, the word alien has only taken on an interplanetary meaning recently. It for most of human history meant other humans who lived in other parts of the world who we had not yet discovered or interacted with. And then you can just look at those trends and patterns. So what was the pattern of immigration like in those cases? What was the pattern of conflict? What was the pattern of disease? What was the pattern of cooperation? And then from that, you can extrapolate a lot of things. So I think you're right that there are going to be some debates which are truly out there. And I think there, the best way to use facts and patterns is to use trends and patterns is to find analogs. But again, I don't even know what that was. So I think you're right, but always remember, even in debates where there's no counterfactual, like the aliens and humanity's awareness of them debate, it is still better to use trends and patterns over isolated facts, right? So your question is applying to cases where neither of them would be super helpful. And then you're like, well, which one would still be slightly more helpful? So you can imagine the aliens debate, you just overly index on one example, which is like, Pizarro and the Incans, let's just say, or Columbus and the Native Americans, let's just say. And then someone's like, well, what about all of these other examples where it went super well? So even in those cases where you're debating debates without like a firm context in mind, it still makes sense when comparing it to isolated facts to focus on trends and patterns. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Nadeem, I'm going to take you and then I'm going to move on. Go on.
So how can we use facts and claims in trends and patterns in like hypothetical motion? Let's say there is a motion like this house would give all animals human levels of cognition and power of speech. This is something which never happened in the world and which is mostly hypothetical. How can we use like trends and patterns in those hypothetical motions?
Would you say that motion again, just so I can tackle that example?
The motion is this house would give all animals human levels of cognition and powers of speech.
Yeah, I mean, I was really hoping that my alien example would deal with those categories of examples, because it's also the case that we've never been aware of aliens before. So it would be truly something unique and unprecedented. To that specific, I guess I could in this case just like respond to the specific example. So yes, it is the case that we've never given animals higher levels of cognition and higher levels of intelligence and understanding. But we do have lots of evidence on what it's like to be in the presence of smarter animals versus less smart animals, right? Like the distance between dolphins and pigs on one side and cockroaches on the other is like much more significant than the distance between apes and humans, for instance. So we know what it means to have smart animals in the world, or to have smarter animals, and we can probably extract lots of trends and patterns from that. We also know that we know what it's like to live in a world where certain beings are thought of having higher cognition than others, right? So what does that world look like? Well, 200 years ago, what were the trends and patterns about people saying that white folks have higher cognition and intelligence than other people, that science was in fact proving this through some faulty methods. We also know that when the point at which people say that certain communities, animal communities, other human communities, do have intelligence, do have cognition, there's a natural moral claim to making rights about them, right? Like you don't make rights about cockroaches to the same level that you do about pigs. And sort of one of the main drivers there is just intelligence and cognition. So I can already think of like 4 ways in which you can extrapolate lots of trends and patterns. And this is the point I was trying to make before, which is in the absence of a factual context for a debate where you're debating something which is like quite unprecedented, try to find analogs, analogies. I think that's the best way to do it. Abdullah, okay, I'll take you super quickly and then I want to move on, but go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, Hamza bhai, I consider myself to be a debater who is generally less informed. So can you please just quickly let me know about some resources or like cheap documents from where I can improve my facts about generally like these motions?
About these facts and patterns, or just anything to do with debate?
Like generally, I think anything to do with debates that also translates into these like trends as well.
Yeah, so I think the first part of the question is like so broad. Like I would love for you to sort of maybe put in the chat like more specific examples where you would need something, because in my mind everything applies to debate. So I would be like a never-ending list. I think you're right to point out that it's hard to think of obvious places to find trends and patterns. So I think the first thing that I will say is there's lots of economic and policy debates, to the first questioner's point, to Roland's point, where it is quite easy to find them, right? So if you look at the World Bank database, the IMF database, I mean, the rise of the international NGO in every space, from Human Rights Watch to Amnesty International, means that they're publishing infographics on everything, right? Like, that collated data on everything from human rights abuses across history to economic aid packages, to where taxation worked and where taxation didn't. Like all of that data exists in graphical form. You just have to search it. And usually it'll be some kind of international NGO or international organization which is publishing this data. This data that's in other situations still that will be harder to find. And there, I think an important thing I should point out is that you shouldn't just use facts as trends and patterns. You should consume them as trends and patterns. So I think one thing I noticed implicitly when I was just, I never matter filed per se, but I enjoy reading quite a lot. And I just noticed that I was categorizing things as part of broader trends and patterns in my own head whenever I was reading. So like, if I was reading a book about the French Revolution, and then 6 weeks later, I read a book about the Velvet Revolution. And then 3 years later, I read a book about the Glorious Revolution. And a few months after that, I read about like Euromaidan or something. These are all in radically different contexts. But in my head, I wasn't just reading those books as facts about that specific society and system. I was reading them as additional data points in my head of, okay, so in these 5 major revolutions, X tended to happen. So I think you should also perhaps think about becoming that kind of reader who's not just doing deep reading of the specific thing that's in front of them, but has file cabinets in their head where this one goes into revolutions, or this one goes into Europe, or this one goes into economy. And I think that would help. All right, let's talk about claims briefly, and then I'm going to switch back to just like general questions that people have. So I think one thing that I often find is people find hard to do is making claims which are interesting past their first claim. So like you go into a debate and you're like, I'm going to make a claim about economic injustice or some kind of physical harm to some folks in some part of the world or something. And then I've noticed that there's a rapid decline in quality of teams' second claims and third claims. So I think one thing that we try to do when we were debating together, my debate partner and I, is try to, let me put this down, focus on non-contingency as a way of thinking of second claims. So I feel like people will retrospectively be in a debate and be like, yeah, you know what, this one was non-contingent or something like that. But people don't intentionally use this as a debate strategy. So I can give you an example here just to make this like more grounded. So there's a debate that we participated in. It's an old debate that's happened many times before about the global feminist movement and its position on the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And obviously this is in the context, again, like as you can see, I always think in terms of facts. It's the reason this debate comes up is because there was a mandate from the Bush administration that the intervention in Afghanistan is partly to do with the liberation of Afghan women. And the question is, what should the Western, it was the Western feminist movement, what should their position be on this issue? And you can already imagine that like there's already ideas going through your head about like, well, are these interventions good for women? Are these interventions bad for women? But all of that stuff. And often what happens is this becomes the whole debate. And I think my debate partner and I in this debate, actually learning from another version of this debate that happened earlier, we're like, well, all of these seem to be contingent on a common premise, which is the feminist movement should do what is best in this case for what happens with the interventions. But that's assuming that the feminist movement has an impact on, in that case, the Bush administration, or just on government's foreign policy and war making more broadly. Well, that could be true, and we should probably still make claims about whether interventions are good or bad for women. But that doesn't seem to be the whole debate. So then we were like, well, what would be a claim that's not about that? And then we thought, well, what about a claim which is about the feminist movement and what its perception is, depending on what position it takes? So our second claim became then, independent of what happens with these interventions, the feminist movements only have like so much political capital to affect change on foreign policy. So while we do want to show that interventions in this case are good for women, we were on that side of the debate. We also want to show that the feminist movement taking this position is good for the feminist movement. So that claim, again, does not rely on the contingency of affecting foreign policy or defense policy. It just relies on the perception of the feminist movement, depending on what position it takes. And if you want, I can go through examples of any debate that you can throw at me. But I think like non-contingency is a huge aspect of making claims which are high quality when it comes to your second claim and third claim. It's very hard to do, but always almost be adversarial with your case partner, being like, you made claim X, and then he or she might be like, well, what about claim Y? And I'm like, nope, same thing. Claim Z, nope, same thing. And then you just keep going through it. And then you end up with claim XYZ, which is a very robust first claim. And then you finally have a second claim that's non-contingent. I want to make sure everyone got what I was saying there. So is there a question specifically about that? Is that Metis? Is that how you say it? In your opinion, why do second and third claims tend to be less well substantiated? I think I was just trying to make that point. It's just because they rely on similar premises, right? So they're just going to lack an analysis. Like, think about it. Like, if you're using one premise to make 5 points, all of those 5 points will be diluted in argumentative quality, which is to say by level of analysis attached to them. But if you're making 5 points using 3 premises, then you have a lot more to work with. Premises are just like mixtures of logic and fact, which propose something about the world that's intuitive to people. And if you overly rely on the same premise to make lots of different points, your claims will just come off as slightly shallow or uncompelling and easy to respond to. And that's why non-contingency is super important. Does anyone have any specific question about non-contingency in terms of case prep? Let me just check. Yes, you can get this document later. That's fine. I'll just send it to people. All right. I think the next thing for us to think about when it comes to case prep is stakeholders. And I think I have covered a version of this at some point before in some session. So I hope this isn't redundant for folks. But in case prep, it is vital to do multi-level actor analysis. This is another way in which we were noticing that people were just like too shallow in their analysis when it comes to making claims about the world. So a generic example here would be something about two different state parties, right? Like, so let's say, well, considering the current context, let's say Israel and Palestine in this case. And you would notice that a lot of debates which have historically happened about this, not just in competitive debate, mind you, but also just generally in the world, tend to focus at like one level of abstraction, which is there is an entity which is called Palestine. In this case, there's an entity called Israel. And then we're making claims about the world, about how to deal with them and how they should deal with each other. The problem with this obviously is in the context of competitive debate, you're just missing out several different actors who are at different levels of analysis. So one way to think about what's happening in Israel and Palestine is to think about Israel and Palestine, by which we usually mean the Israeli people generically defined and the Palestinian people generically defined, or the Israeli government generically defined and the Palestinian authorities generically defined. What we often do in those contexts is, well, okay, that's one way to think about the debate. What are the three others? And one of them tends to be, what is Israel made up of? Well, you know, Israel has the Knesset, which has a fairly diverse coalition of parties, politically speaking. You know, you have left-wing Arab coalitions, you have the right-wing Likud party, you have folks in the middle. How do all of these people engage with the debate? When it comes to the Israeli people, you know, again, like there's a lot of Arabs who live in Israel. What do they think about the world? What do progressive Israelis think about the world? Generically speaking, what does the Jewish hard right think about the world? How does that interact with the other? Same thing with Palestine. You know, it's not just Fatah and Hamas, right? Like, you know, there's competing factions for power within both of these entities. That's also the case within Palestine, where, like, you know, one trivially, just like, you know, there's a huge difference between the West Bank and Gaza. But, you know, even within the West Bank, you know, whether you're in Ramallah or Nablus kind of tends to matter. Whether you're in the Gaza city or on the outskirts tends to matter, what your political opinions are. So there's lots of different things which start coming in. And this is all going a level down. You can also go a level up, right? So one could also say that the best way to think about the Israel-Palestine conflict is as a conflict more generically in the Middle East, one which would have to involve Iran and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon at least, and then perhaps also involve countries like Egypt and countries like Sudan, and so on and so forth. So we often notice that once we moved away from this like simple argumentative mistake of focusing on one level of actor analysis, which is usually the level which is given in the motion. So the motion isn't saying, what do the varying factions in Israel and Palestine think? They say, the motion implies, what does Israel and Palestine think? What does the United States think? What does Microsoft think? So the motion has encoded within it an implicit preference for focusing on the actor at the level of the actor. But, you know, that's almost never a good idea. You should focus on Microsoft in terms of its shareholders, within that, the sort of activist venture capitalist types, traditional blue chip shareholders versus workers in the US versus workers abroad, which are outsourced. Like, you get into all sorts of like interesting complication, and you end up like quadrupling, tripling your analysis when it comes to debate. So again, just like non-contingency, this like multi-level actor thing kind of makes obvious sense once you think about it, but it's hard to do. So I would really ask you to focus on trying to do this with your partner. Try to think of like a non-contingent argument. Try to think of every debate at different levels of actor analysis. And I think those two would be really helpful for your case prep. As you will notice, I've focused on like these 4 overarching things that we've often felt were missing in case prep strategies when it comes to debate, instead of just like, being like, how do you make an argument or something? But I think to some extent they affect every single debate that you will be in and every single case that you will prep. So I'm going to stop here. Those were the 4 sort of non-obvious insights I wanted to share. Now I'm just going to take lots of questions. I'm assuming that folks have questions across the board about case prep, and I want to get through as many of them as possible. So yeah, like, are there any questions? Or not?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sorry. Let's do Anas and then let's do Omar. Anas, go ahead.
It's a pretty beginner level question, but like, what does it truly mean to look at the motion strategically and make points accordingly?
Could you be more specific? Has there been a case where you were struggling to do so? Maybe there I can give a specific response.
Like, I mean, how do you identify multiple actors in a particular debate if you do not have as much knowledge?
Yeah, so okay, that's a different question from the one you started off with. Yeah, so I mean, the easy answer to your first question is the actors are defined in the motion, right? Like the motion doesn't say this house believes that anyone should do something at some point. Like, all of those things have like specific factual indexes attached to them. Microsoft should do X and Y. Israel, Palestine, like there's so many examples like this. So that's one, which is they've given you the basic ingredients, and then it's your job to break down these actors and go a higher level up. I think the second part of your question is actually quite legitimate and interesting, which is just like, how do we, make claims about the difference between the left-wing Arab coalition, the Likud in the Israeli Knesset, if we just don't have very specialized knowledge? Well, I think one thing I will say is this is a real argument for reading as deeply as possible. I think there's been a dearth of reading, and I think this is the reason why I have a staunch opposition to matter files, because it's like, it's a debating cheat code, and I've almost never seen a team which has a matter file do really well. They do well, like they'll be okay-ish, but they'll never be like the top speakers in any given year. And that's because, if you're just like copy pasting facts about the world, and then you can rely on them at any point, like, that's basically you debating via ChatGPT. Like, it's not really you debating by having spent weeks just reading for pleasure, having that kind of engagement with books and literature. The second thing I'll say is, let's say you were doing that, you're still in a debate where you just don't have the facts on hand. I mean, get to the closest possible facts. Like, again, like, I'm sure you can assume that within the Israeli government, not every single person's the same. So there's probably opposition to the war and support for the war. I think that much anyone can intuit, like, knowing nothing about Israel in this is Palestine, where it's the case that even if you don't know what the intricacies of like Abu Mazen and all of that stuff, you can intuit that, like, there's probably a difference between the PLO and Hamas. There's probably some conflict within Hamas. Any other group I can think of that's like Hamas had conflict within it. So there's probably 2 different factions here. So I think, yeah, one, read a lot. Read because it's the best way to be really good, and it just helps you outside of debate tremendously. And debate should be an incentive to read, and that's where I think Matterfile is making both debate and debaters worse after debate. But second, even in cases where you don't have that factual context on hand, intuit. There will always be interesting divisions between people because we have never met a group of people, a company, a government, a nation, a people who have ever been all the same. So, you can probably start with that as some kind of starting point to make your analysis. I think the next person is Jawad, and then it's Samrit. Yeah, just raise your hands if possible, just so that helps me see who has a question.
Okay, am I audible?
Yep.
Yep, okay. First of all, my question is like I'm a med student, and there are a lot of sources. Like some people say you have to learn philosophy from philosophy tube channel and other stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like what would you suggest? Like where can we learn philosophy from in a very coherent way and in our hectic routine and political science? It can be YouTube, it can be literature, and daily stuff. What would you suggest?
Jawad, what are you studying in college, if you don't mind me asking?
Pharmacy.
Okay, that's such an interesting point because I think it must be so. It wasn't hard for me because I had a discipline which was I was doing international relations and then I did public policy. So I was in disciplines where, for one thing, it was definitely easy to read quite broadly. And then, if I may say so, it was just definitely easy. And what that meant was I just had like a lot of spare time to read. So I really feel for people who are in disciplines like pharmacology and medicine and still have to find somehow the time to read about this stuff. I think a couple of things I'll say there. So the first thing I'll say is try to always look at your own discipline deconstructively, and that will often help you get to literature, which is interesting. Jawad, are you studying in Pakistan?
Yes, I am.
So as you know, the rub in Pakistan is like, especially with the sciences, is like an overemphasis on memorization and rote learning. And this is why it's really interesting where it's like, whenever I get questions on email or messenger or whatever, the only people who ask me questions like, what are the 3 things I can read to be good at debate? Like it's always people from South Asia. And like it's emblematic of us being taught that like, you have to cram, you have to have like that chit with like, there's 60 things on it. And then if you do that, you'll do well at exams or in this case at debate. So I would really invite you to not think like that. I don't think you do in this case from how I read the question, but I think many people do. So it's just a thing I want to point out. But yeah, look at your discipline deconstructively. So for instance, if you're doing pharmacology, there's one of the most famous books in the history of the 20th century is called A History of the Medical Sciences by Foucault, right? Like, it's an interesting book about how people came to perceive medicine as a means of control. That to say that someone who wants the right to vote, like a woman in this case, is not doing something illegal, but is doing something medically insane, is a means of exercising control, which is different from just like, arresting her at a march or something like that. And that's really interesting. There's fascinating books about how, the pharmacology industry has consistently tried to stop the supply of free vaccines, for instance, all the way back to polio. And that's interesting. And then there's books about, the positive role that them played, for instance, in the smallpox case. So, yeah, like, start with your own discipline, dude. Like, I think we're taught often in that sort of system to look at our discipline, like, sort of dispassionately. And as like a technical craft, like everything's taught like a technical craft. But, start from your own discipline, look at it deconstructively. That will help you be interested in stuff. In terms of your specific question on like, what are the things that would be helpful for philosophy? Again, like I'm trying to push back against the tendency of these questions because it implies that like, if you read X or watch Y, then you're sort of stocked up on your philosophy. I think the greatest resource that has ever existed for debaters is Wikipedia. One, because as we know, despite all the jokes, it's like astonishingly reliable, and it's a complete scandal that it's still not something that you can cite in most cases in most academic contexts, even though it tends to be often as reliable as the Britannica encyclopedia. The second is that Wikipedia allows you to scroll through different things. So to your philosophy point, I think just go to Wikipedia and just be most famous philosophical thinkers. They will literally have a list. And then you can click through whoever you're liking, whoever you're finding interesting, and you can go through them. You will be able to go through like a million hyperlinks just on the specific question that you asked. And there are people there that you will find more interesting. There are people who I found more interesting, and that's why my debating has a specific style and a specific flavor to its content. So don't try to cram. If you do want to cram, just use Wikipedia. And just try to find the people within philosophy, within pharmacology, who you would find the most interesting. I hope that answers your question. At the same time, if there's something like super specific, like who do you think is a good person to read on like post-colonial feminism in Iraq or something like super specific, I can just give you an author. I know that it's hard to find something that specific, but when it comes to like generic questions, who should I read on philosophy? Read broadly and find people you like, and that's the way to stay interested. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. I was just concerned about the patterns and not about cramming specifically, but about how can I like co-opt these stuff in my daily life to learn more. I do watch series and stuff which do like aggravate my thinking and which helps me in debates, like hypothetical stuff. But I'm just concerned because you are a very philosophy. You're good at it. I've seen your sessions and I just wanted to learn more. Thank you so
No,
much.
of course. And this is true for you and for everyone. If there's very specific, particular things that you would want to talk about with philosophy, please drop me a message. Happy to send you something, whatever. But thank you for the question. Samrat?
Hello, yes, am I audible?
Yep.
So there's an issue I've faced recently, but I'll recycle the same analysis for different parts of my argument. So I'll use the same analysis to prove my premise and then to prove my impacts, which I think reduces the quality of my arguments. How do I tackle that?
Can you give me an example?
I don't have a specific example right now, but it looks like I'll state a few reasons initially to prove my premise, and then I'll refer back to those reasons when I'm proving my impacts later.
Yeah, but I think maybe that's just not how I think about claims. So what are claims? So a claim is why is this true? Why is this important? So the reasons for why this is true will then become by definition different from the reasons for why this is important. And if you're struggling with this, I've had some people I've coached who struggle with this, explicitly use this specific typology. I think that's the way to do it. Because then you will just be coming up with probabilistic reasons in the first case and impact reasons in the second. Just have a sheet which literally has these two different questions on two different sheets. That's I found was like a pretty easy lock cognitively for a lot of people. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
No worries. And Anas, again, could you suggest a specific author is the point I was trying to make, which is the specific author on what? Just philosophy? What kind of philosophy? In which region? On what issue? Read broadly, go on Wikipedia, look at lots of different philosophy authors. And then, if there's questions you have about a specific kind of philosophy or philosopher, I'm happy to suggest an author. Omar, go ahead.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yep.
My question was, in a lot of morality-based arguments or morality-based motions, a problem we've been having is that I'll immediately be able to form a negative case and we'll immediately have rebuttals, but we won't have a main argument. We'll only have one LOA or two LOAs, whereas in our rebuttals and what we think prop could bring to the argument, we'll have 4 to 5 LOAs, which I suppose they could bring. And in a lot of cases, all 4 of them they mentioned, but we really struggle in a morality argument to bring more LOAs from our side. What would you do in a morality based argument, something on giving rights to two equal beings or people, or giving someone the right to leave or come back, something like that?
So you struggle with making constructive material. Dude, I don't know. We can go through this. And I'm also happy to maybe at some point do something on moral claims that's dedicated to it. But so a few things. So I think the first thing is you have to find intuition pumps which already work in the world. So for instance, like, there's a debate about currently happening about whether human enhancement is good. So should you be allowed to take a pill or have like a technology make you like super intelligent, and whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. Now, you're right. Like, people will have like good rebuttal claims on both sides, but let's think about this debate for a second. So, well, if in order for you to be much smarter, can we flip it? Should you be much stupider? So would you want to live in a world where humanity has less intelligence? Now, people would say, no, obviously not. Like we have the, like, we just don't want less intelligence. So then people are left with defending a fairly narrow moral position, which is the amount of intelligence humans have in 2024 is exactly the right amount. And we shouldn't do anything to change that in any way upwards. Now, that's a moral claim that's super interesting because it's about the history of inequality. It's about how intelligence is tied up in power, how the human species was able to progress specifically through its collective intelligence. And by having more of that, you're much more likely to see greater moral progress. You can apply that same framework to the debate on animals and cognition, which is, again, well, would you like yourself to be less intelligent? No. Well, why? Well, for one reason, you enjoy like, a state of consciousness where you can experience moments and like, give them meaning. For another, you've noticed that people who are deemed to be less intelligent tend to have less rights in society, or deemed to be less intelligent tend to have less rights in society. So you're like, okay, so I lose experience and I lose equality. Well, should other things that exist have equality and experience? The answer is probably. And then you can make like a pretty robust moral claim from that to like animals having higher cognition. I don't know. I think that's often the way to do it, which is always think about the flip side, which is if you're making a moral claim in favor of something, think about what the opposite of that would be like. That allows you to often construct interesting arguments. There's 100 other strategies, but I think this strategy tends to be the easiest. I hope that answers your question. Josefa.
Yeah, I had two questions in general. Firstly, with regards to second speeches, like do second speeches and like do second speakers have the same way of going about case prep as you have mentioned, or is it something that deputies and whip do differently when they're not communicating with their partners? And also, like, what do you do when you're in, in the closing benches, and if like, the arguments that you make, like your opening may take them. So how do you go about case prep differently when you're in closings and like generally when you're a second speaker as well?
Okay. Trying to figure out a way to answer this economically. Let's take the second one first. So there's lots of strategies that you can use in closing, but I think to the point that I was making about non-contingency, the best to combine now both of your questions, the best strategies for closing are the best strategies for a second speaker. So for instance, as you know, a lot of teams can only win on a member if they have an extension that's not contingent on the opening half, right? Like it's the easiest way to win a debate in closing. Well, you should do that in your second speaker speech. You should have a claim that's completely not contingent on your first speaker speech. And I think so I think one good heuristic to think about is my deputy speeches should be as good as closing speeches. They should have much newer premises for rebuttal than my first speaker. They should have much newer premises for constructive argument than my first speaker. I am almost trying to beat my first speaker is what you should think about. And that I think allows you to craft like fairly different deputy arguments. On the point about closing strategy generally, so one element will be non-contingency, but like generally the way we think about this is wash, analyze, new. So there used to be an acronym that we had, but doesn't really matter. But WASH is mitigate why both sides in opening are talking about analysis, which is contingent on premises, which are unlikely to be true. So for instance, in the feminist debate case, OG says wars are bad for women. O says wars are good for women. CG says doesn't really matter, and because the feminist movement doesn't affect foreign policy. Now, you could make that claim on both closing government or closing opposition, which is what the interesting thing about clever washes is always. Second is analyze. Take their best claim on why interventions are good or bad for women and give like newer analysis on it. And then the third is just have a non-contingent argument, which in that case was obviously why this is harmful or beneficial for the procession of the feminist movement. That tends to be our general typology for closing strategies. Wash, analyze their top argument better than them, and come up with a new argument. I hope that answers your question. I'll take questions for like 5 more minutes, and then I'm happy to like, come back and do more questions or something like that. That's okay. Imran.
All right. So sometimes there are debates where the broad characterization, like let's assume there's like one actor who would prefer to do X, but then op says they want to do Y. And these things are like directly contradicting each other, but it's hard to resolve which of these is probably either more likely or more important, because I think there's like an understanding that these like two incentives could coexist. So for example, maybe it's a journalist debate do X, and then a gov team says they want money, and an op team says, no, you care about your morals, no, you care about this. In that specific instance, how would you like go about resolving this like deadlock per se?
Sorry, I didn't get the morals thing. So are both sides saying that they're going to use a pot of money? Well, could you rephrase
Oh no,
that?
so like it's like a trade-off. Maybe one side is pursuing money and the other's opposition is possibly trading off that money for some other benefit, like possibly like welfare or something that does that make sense?
Okay, but they're both playing with the same bucket of money, right?
Not sure what that means.
Could you give me an example of a motion? Maybe that's the way to do it.
Okay. I'll find a motion and then I think I can get back to you a bit later. You could just ask answer someone else's question.
I just want to be helpful. That's why. All right, sounds good. Prateek. Prateek, did you have a question?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yep.
Hello. So I wanted to ask this that as an ESL speaker, and usually that I'm in my novice stage, that I'm still like have begun debate in 1 year, I often face difficulty in like delivering the content in a manner which is persuadable to the edge. So oftentimes in BP debates, I see that even though I'm able to generate ideas, the way I'm delivering it isn't as effective, and the closing benches are like doing the same ideas in a better way and taking the debate. So how do you think I can improve on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's also complicated because I think sometimes this notion that like there's a thing such as an EPL extension, it's obviously legitimate. Like, there's a long history of like people from Oxbridge, like, using that to win debates. But I think to some extent, it's also been, I think, overemphasized, because what that means is the implicit presumption becomes that ESL speakers are supposed to be the content heavy speakers with bad style and make lots of mechanisms. And then EPL speakers are supposed to have like stylistic flair and all of those things. So I just wouldn't fall into that trap is my first reaction. Like, I, for instance, have almost no content in my debates. So, there's always an argument to work on your style, no matter what, like, the structural biases of the debate community are. In terms of making sure that your arguments aren't like, so-called appropriated by other people. I think the best way to do this, so I did coach a couple of ESL teams, is to have a sheet where the clearest and simplest distillation of your argument in 2 sentences, something like, so you said something with 3 minutes, let's just say, for why this is true, why this is important. And then you have this like kicker that you've physically written down, because I know with fluency problems, you can't just come up with it on the fly. But you've written it down and you look at it and you say, so this claim has shown you, panel, that X is true for Y reason, and it's important for Z reason. Now I'm going to move on. If you have something written intentionally which concludes that argument, it becomes a lot more difficult for teams to appropriate it. Because otherwise, I know, I used to have big problems with fluency. And I know sometimes just in the heat of an argument, it becomes hard to be like, oh, wow, I said 5 smart things, but they don't think it's the same argument as closing, and closing saying it so much better, but I said it and I'm going to lose the debate. Best way to solve that, have an explicit sheet which has 2 already written sentences on the argument. That'll hopefully help. Roland. Sorry, before Roland, I think there's a question in the chat. Ali, would you be audible? Because I think you have a question. And then I'll take one from Hamza and then I'll stop. Ali, did you want to say it audibly?
Yeah,
Can you?
yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I had a similar question to what Imran asked to. I was asking that how do you win the debate when the case is somewhat similar from both sides? Meaning it's usually because of opposition doing unfair characterization, or proposition, for example, trying to bring up alternatives that is a burden on opposition side, but then it ends up making the cases similar from both sides, but then it gets very hard to resolve from both sides.
Do you have an example?
You can go on with the other questions. I had a debate. I'll try remembering it. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, because I think I'm just maybe it's just early morning for me, but I'm struggling.
I'll ask later then.
Okay. Hamza, you had a question.
Sure. In multi-actor analysis, opening always has this edge that they can, for instance, present the big obvious actor. So if you're in closing, for instance, how do you prove that your small new actor is more vulnerable or better than the, let's say, actor given by the opening team? Because judges have this notion that they often discard minority arguments because they don't have as much impact, and for instance, they are not as intuitive.
So I think I maybe miscommunicated what I meant by the multi-level actor analysis. So the multi-level actor analysis is not looking at different actors. It's looking at the same actors at different levels of analysis. That's why it's called multi-level actor analysis, not multi-actor analysis. So Israel is still made up of 50 political factions, right? And so is Palestine in this case. So when you're coming in and closing, you actually have an advantage here, because what's happening is not that they're using the big actor and you're using the small actor. It's that big actor in reality is made up of smaller actors. And the best way to analyze the big actor is by looking at the smaller actors. Or on the flip side, this actor is made up of a larger system, let's say the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East, let's just say. And the best way to understand this big actor is part of a bigger system in the whole. So I think you're right, probably, that there's some arguments which are dismissed when it comes to minority stakeholders, but to some extent, that's not what this strategy is getting at. The strategy is getting at looking at actors as part of a bigger system. And then within those actors, there's sub-actors, but it's never one small actor versus a big actor. The small actors make up the big actor. Does that make sense?
Yep, perfectly.
Jawad, did you still have another question, or is your hand just accidentally raised?
I'm sorry, it was just.
No worries. Okay, so Imran, you have to send me this motion on Facebook message or something so I can go through it, and I'm happy to answer it. I'll just take one question from Roland here, and then I'll probably stop. Roland, go ahead.
So my question was the same as Imran's question. It's just that I was bringing an example, the actor motion. So if you are going to answer it later, then I guess.
Oh, amazing. Let me just answer Imran's question then. This asks if China would stop using known conditions and demands to achieve political goals. Wow, such a strange motion. China wants to stop because loan conditions make themselves look back. China doesn't care about them looking back. They want soft. Well, if they want soft power, then they do care about them looking bad. So I don't get why I'm saying that. Both of these characterizations could possibly be true at the same time. Like soft power could be symmetric alongside not wanting to look back. So maybe we understand what different things about what soft power means. Soft power literally means countries liking you. That's what soft power is, like through movies and culture and good diplomacy. Like that's all soft power. So any country which does not want to make themselves look bad has good soft power or powerful. Well, soft power. Sorry for being redundant. Yeah, Imran, let's have one more knock at this. Can you explain this, please?
Okay. Sorry. I think it probably because the debate I had a different understanding. So the soft power thing was more of just like I think the way that Op argued it was they wanted things like the whole loan conditions means that you can seize assets in countries like Sri Lanka and things like that. So by using these loan conditions, you get those opportunities. That's what they meant by soft power. The Gulf claim is still sort of the same thing. I think they ran that the United States will demonize you and villainize you, and the impact of that is other countries you may want to work with don't
Yeah.
like you, so that screws over as China that screws over your opportunities.
Yeah, okay, I see your meaning. So I think to your question about how would both sides resolve this, I think one is the trivial answer is just make your characterization. So like you can almost go through every lesson I have here as a case study here. So for instance, think of facts in debate that are trends and patterns over facts in isolation. Like whichever side can like prove that this model of the Chinese approach has been historically better for China and countries like China through lots of trends and patterns, is probably like more likely to win the debate than the other one. Then I also talked about non-contingency. So a big problem with how Gov and Op are framing this is that they're both relying on singular premises. The first being soft power matters the most, which is what Gov's saying. Op saying soft power doesn't matter. China cares about having influence over these countries. Well, that's about 50% debate. Like there's lots of other reasons why China shouldn't use loan conditions and defaults. So for instance, the Chinese economy has suffered a lot. It might be on the verge of a credit crisis. That's one reason not to use loan conditions and defaults. Another reason not to use it is because it incentivizes the United States to take a more active involvement in some countries over others. Op, on the flip side, can say that China should in fact use loan conditions and defaults, specifically because its domestic manufacturing sector has suffered blows because of the chips industry and all of those things. So it needs to set up these different hubs elsewhere to display some of the economic impact. So that's examples of arguments which aren't even reliant on the Gov framing and the Op framing. So those would be my two strategies. One is just analyze your frame deeper than the other side. And the second is do not rely on that frame. There's other frames that you can use in debates for both Gov and Op, which don't rely on it. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I'm really happy with the very sort of diverse set of questions that came up. And I'm happy to send something like this to the debate forum folks, and then they can send it to you guys. And yeah, like, if you have more questions, always feel free to follow up. I'm really happy that I got the chance to do this, and I'm happy to come back at some point. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Hamza.
Thank you, Hamza.